All right, welcome and falcha to yet another edition of Random Thoughts from County Antrim on August 22, the year 2021. I'm your host, David McDonnell, and it's my half hour-ish of stories, yarns, historical information, and random thoughts. I started this podcast, a little over a year ago, when we got into the lockdown, and I kept telling myself, I'm going to give up this thing as soon as I can get out in the real world and start telling stories, which might actually happen next month, because I've got a gig in Indianapolis in September. And I almost did not do tonight's podcast. And I'll tell you why. I'm hard at work on a novel, and it's coming along quite nicely. I think it's going to be good. I know it's a very, very good story. I just hope I can write it in a way that captivates the reader. So we shall see. But I've been immersed in that, and I wasn't sure I was going to be able to do a podcast or have the energy to do a podcast this evening. But as I was doing my research, I came across something about the Fenians, and it reminded me of a story about the Fenians. So I thought I would tell that to you tonight. It's a little-known chapter in American history, Irish history, and Canadian history. And it involves a ridiculous scheme, almost comical, by some very delusional people. And so it makes for a rather bizarre story. Now, who were the Fenians? It was a secret society. It operated under two principles, and one is the complete independence of Ireland from the British. And the second was a notion that independence could only be achieved through violence. And so the members took a secret oath, and they existed in the 19th and early 20th century in both Ireland and, actually not both, it was Ireland, United States, and Canada. Now in Ireland it operated under the name the Irish Republican Brotherhood. But both groups were actually founded in America by Irish immigrants who called themselves the Fenian Brotherhood. It was named after the warriors of the Fenian cycle, and I talked about the Fenian cycle at an earlier podcast, and I told one of the stories about Finn McCool. I think the story I told you was the legend of Knockmany. And it was from these legends that the group acquired their name, Fenians. And by the 1860s, there were at least 1 million Irish immigrants in the United States. And that number may have been closer to 1.5 million. And most of them were destitute and penniless and living in urban squalor. Most of them just wanted to survive, try to make $1 or $2 a day in their labor, and with that feed their family and hopefully acquire a better life in America than they had in Ireland. But there were those who dreamed of returning to Ireland, and they wanted to return with a powerful army, and with that drive out the British from Ireland. And two of these men were John O'Mahony and Michael Duhaney, and they founded the Fenian Brotherhood. Now, O'Mahony was from County Cork. He came to New York in the early 1850s. Duhaney was from Tipperary. He came to New York a little bit earlier. I think it was 1849-ish. And together they recruited men to be trained as soldiers in America, to be sent later to Ireland. And they also recruited a man named James Stephens in Dublin. And Stephens did the same thing in Ireland as the Irish Republican Brotherhood. And they trained in secret in Ireland because it was an illegal organization. Now, within a few years, the Fenians in America had a few thousand recruits who trained as soldiers. And this actually fit the times. Militia membership was very, very common in America in the 19th century. It was part of the social life. This was true in small towns all over the country and in urban areas as well. Men met on weekends, they trained, they marched, they shot, they learned the manual of arms, they learned how to march, they went on parades, and it became social events. This were the camaraderie among the men, but then they were followed up with picnics, family picnics, to be part of the local militia. So this was the right atmosphere for these two men to recruit Irish immigrants, and they joined the Fenians rather than joining the local regiment of the state militia. Now this all changed in 1861, which is, if you know your history, that's when the Confederates bombed Fort Sumter, and it was the start of the American Civil War. Now with that, Abraham Lincoln called for volunteers, and men all over the northern states, including the Irish, enlisted in the army. Some Fenian brigades and some some mostly Irish state militia regiments just enlisted en masse into the state voluntary regiments to go off to war. Now, initially, O'Mahony was upset with this because he tried to stop the Fenian units from joining the state militias, the state volunteer regiments, and going off to war. And this was in part a notion that this isn't our fight. But it also was a fear, which turned out to be prophetic, that these mostly Irish regiments in the Northern Army would soon be in battle against mostly Irish units in the Confederate Army, and that turned out to be true. Most notably at Antietam and Fredericksburg, but several other places where you had Irish regiments on both sides trying to kill each other. But it wasn't long after that O'Mahony had sort of a complete about-face. He'd been trying to train Irish men to become soldiers, and it dawned on him that maybe he could have the United States Army do this for him. And the coming battles would make these Irish soldiers combat veterans, and they would be capable of fighting quite ably for Irish independence. And O'Mahony himself organized a regiment. I think it was called the 99th New York Guard. And there were many, many regiments, again, on both sides, that were all Irish or predominantly Irish. And of course, they flew the American flag when they went into battle, but they also carried a green flag. Often those green flags had a depiction of the Brian Boru harp. There's a famous quote by a Confederate general, and I can't remember which general it was, but it was at the Battle of Malvern Hill in Virginia. An Irish brigade charged a well-entrenched Confederate unit several times, repulsed each time, but they kept coming back. And the general looked through his binoculars and saw the brigade was reforming for yet another attack. And what he said was, "Here comes that damn green flag again." Now, the war ended in 1845, 4 long, hard years of fighting. And the Fenians had very high hopes that these Irish soldiers would be ready to liberate Ireland from the British. But that was one of the many Fenian delusions. The Civil War was especially brutal. There was well over 600,000 men died in that war, and many, many more than that were seriously wounded. Loss of arms, loss of legs, half their head disappeared. Very, very serious wounds. And there were very, very few of those Irish veterans who had any interest of going back to Ireland. What they really wanted, what most soldiers wanted, the vast majority of soldiers wanted when the war was over, was to go home. And home to them was in America. It was not in Ireland. So the plan did not quite have the numbers that the Fenians had hoped. Now, there were a few Irish veterans who did return to Ireland, and they became part of the Irish Republican Brotherhood, but they were very, very easy to spot. Their speech was different. Just a decade or so out of Ireland and into America, they picked up more American dialect, American accent than the Irish, still on the island. And they had different expressions they used that were not Irish expressions, they were American expressions. And the fashion was different, and this was news to me. I just found this out. Men in America wore square-toed shoes, which they didn't wear in Ireland. So it was very, very easy to spot who was an American when they were roaming the streets in Ireland. And the Brotherhood, although it was a secret society, wasn't all that secret. The British had infiltrated it to some extent. So many of the Americans who were joined the Irish Republican Brotherhood were quickly arrested. And they were later released by the British. The British didn't want to start any major issues with the United States. And that notion was reciprocal, as you'll see or hear momentarily. But the whole notion of Irish American soldiers fighting for independence in Ireland just sort of faded away after that. Now, with that, the Americans, the American Fenians, splintered as well. There were several factions. One group wanting to do one thing, another group wanting to do another. But one of the splinter groups had a plan, which was started out really as a fantasy more than a plan. And that called for the invasion of Canada. Now, why Canada? What does Canada have to do with Irish independence? Well, keep in mind that Canada was not a country then. It was a British colony. And it actually wasn't even a British colony. It was many British colonies. And they were collectively referred to as British North America. And since the Fenians could not raise an army and get it to Ireland to fight the British, Canada would have to do. And so the fantasy was this. The Fenians would raise an army of battle-hardened Civil War veterans, and they would invade and conquer British North America. And they would negotiate an agreement with a settlement with the British, a trade, Canada for Ireland. The British would give up Ireland and leave for good. And the Fenians would give up Canada and give it back to the British. A trade, even up Canada for Ireland. Now this fantasy turned into a plan, but the plan did not lead to the independence of Ireland. But it did, to an extent, lead to the independence of Canada. So the first step in this plan was to raise money. And the Fenians did this by selling bonds that were issued by the Republic of Ireland. Now, of course, there was no Republic of Ireland then. There wouldn't be until the 20th century. But the Fenians assured the buyers of these bonds that there would be a republic someday. And the bonds would be redeemed then. And it would be soon, because they would win this war, get this exchange, and boom, there would be a Republic of Ireland who would honor these bonds. And thousands of Irish Americans bought into this. They bought bonds issued by the non-existent Republic of Ireland. The Fenians then used the money to buy arms and ammunition. And they stored these at various places in upstate New York, in Vermont, and in Maine. Because these would be the 3 places, the 3 points of the invasion. 3 different invasions of Canada. Now, the first invasion army in Maine did not reach Canada at all. There were about 700 Fenians in Maine, near the New Brunswick border. And this was in 1866, the year after the Civil War ended. And the United States Army got wind of this, and they dispersed the Fenians before they could even enter Canada. So invasion number 1 turned out not to be an invasion at all. The second invasion army actually crossed the Niagara River from Buffalo and entered what is now Ontario. Was then called Upper Canada. And about 800 men crossed, and they were almost all Civil War veterans. And they fought a battle with the Canadians. It's called the Battle of Ridgeway. Now, Ridgeway is a small village. It's across the river from Buffalo and near the north shore of Lake Erie. And the Canadian forces that resisted them were a single company of volunteers. And they were given their weapons only the day before, so it was not a battle-hardened unit in any respect. But actually, it's kind of noted in Canadian history. It's the first battle ever fought exclusively by Canadians and led by Canadian officers. It's a colony. They usually had British officers. It was a fairly intense battle for a short period of time, and about 30 or 40 men on each side were killed in this battle. And it ended as a Fenian victory, and the Canadians retreated into Fort Erie, which is across the river from Buffalo. Now, the Fenian victory, the battle was somewhat of a draw. The Fenian victory came because of a Canadian mistake. The Canadians saw a few Fenians on horseback. And they thought it was Fenian cavalry. And so a Canadian officer gave the command for his men to move in squares. And I won't explain what that means, but it was a tactic in the era for infantry to defend against a cavalry attack, to just move into a square, and they could defend against the attack better. But there really was no Fenian cavalry. It was totally a mistake to order his men to move into squares. But the other Canadian units saw some of them moving around. They didn't realize they were moving in squares. They saw them moving around, and they thought it was a retreat. And so they turned around and retreated, and it turned into a disorder where they ran to Fort Erie. Now, the Fenians then pursued the Canadians to the fort, but they were held off. There were more Canadian militia in the fort as well, and they also had some artillery. So the Fenians were unsuccessful in taking Fort Erie in Ontario. Now, the Fenians expected to have a lot more men, more than double that amount of men available for the fight. But the United States Army seized the Fenian weapons and supplies in Buffalo, and they prevented over 1,000 more Fenians from joining and entering Canada. So the Fenians in Canada decided it was time to retreat. They went back to the coast, the Niagara River, but they were intercepted by a United States Navy ship, the U.S.A. Michigan. And so the Fenians, who were already in Canada, surrendered to the U.S. Army and to the U.S. Navy. At least most of them did. There were some who escaped by crossing the Niagara River on stolen boats and rafts and even logs. They somehow got back across the river. So number 2 was an invasion that actually was an invasion and actually was a battle. Certainly small by the scales of the American Civil War, but it was a shooting battle where people were killed. So the first was in Maine, second was in New York, the third was from Vermont. This makes it a trifecta, invasion from 3 places. There were about 1,200 Fenians who met in St. Albans, Vermont, and then marched to the border. And they entered what the British then called Lower Canada. It's what everyone else calls Quebec. And not all of the Fenians had rifles, because the U.S. Army seized many of these storage places that the Fenians had for storing weapons in Vermont. And they didn't have much food either. As soon as they went across the border into Quebec, they only got about 400 yards or so, and they raided stores for food. So as soon as they got to Canada, they ate. Now there were a few shots fired, as far as I could tell, as far as I found in any records. There were no casualties, but there were some shots fired. And the Fenians took a flag, a British flag that was in the British Customs House near the border. But as they got into Quebec, they heard rumors. I don't know how strong their intelligence was, but they heard rumors that a British Army unit was on the way. So the Fenians got discouraged, turned around, and crossed back into Vermont, into the United States. And who do you think they found when they got back into the United States? They found a unit of the United States Army, and they were all arrested. And that invasion, that third invasion, got all of 400 yards into Canada. Now these 3 raids, these invasions, were quite foolhardy and incredibly foolish. And they had no chance of success, either in conquering Canada or achieving the desired independence or swap for Ireland. And it was quite delusional by the leaders and the participants of those raids. One more delusional element to the effort. The Fenians were convinced that once they got into Canada, they would have tremendous help from the Irish Canadians. And they got none. There were obviously some Irish Canadians who, they were Fenians, Irish Canadians who had supported Irish independence. But they wanted no part in the Fenian invasion of Canada. Now, once these people were arrested, the U.S. government had to figure out what to do with these people. The last thing they wanted was war with Great Britain over this issue. They had yet to recover from the Civil War, North and South. They're not ready for another war. So they had to do something with the Fenians. At the same time, they had to consider Irish voters in America. And if they had hung these Fenians or put them in prison for long prison terms, it wouldn't. You wonder what it would have done to Irish sentiments in the country. So what they did is they let most of the Fenians go. They had to post a nominal bond, but they were released once they posted a bond. In fact, some of them were given tickets so they could go home. I think I have time. I'll just mention a couple more things. I want to talk about, just mention Thomas D'Arcy McGee. Well-known man in Canadian history. He was born in County Louth in Ireland, and he was a fierce activist for Irish independence. And because of that, because of his activities, the British issued a warrant for his arrest. And one step ahead of the law, he got out of Ireland and ended up in New York City. After several years in New York, he moved to Montreal. He felt it was far more hospitable to Irish Catholics than New York City. and he became quite a political activist in Montreal, and became one of the leaders of the Canadian Confederation movement, and was elected to Canada's first parliament. But he was extremely critical of the Fenians, very critical of the whole notion of the Fenians' violence in Ireland and their invasions of Canada. Now, unrelated to that, he participated in a debate in the Canadian Parliament in 1868, and that debate lasted well over midnight. And then he returned after that debate to his rooming house. It was Mrs. Trotter's boarding house in Ottawa. And as soon as he opened the door to his room, he was shot in the head by someone who was waiting for him inside. Now, the man convicted for that killing was a Fenian, Patrick James Whelan. And Whelan was originally from County Galway, but then was living in Ottawa. Now, Whelan was a Fenian, but he claimed he was innocent of the killing. But despite that, he was found guilty, and he was hung. And it was a public hanging with about 5,000 spectators. So he was killed because he supposedly shot McGee, and McGee was assassinated because he was anti-Fenian. Now, I said that the Fenians did not, the invasions did not lead to Irish independence, but may have led to Canadian independence, and here's why. And that's a bit of an overstatement. It is an overstatement, but here's why I said that. Canadians had talked about union and confederation of the several Canadian colonies for many years. And that made a lot of political and economic sense to many Canadians for the colonies to be united as a single self-governing colony. Now, the Fenians, when they invaded Canada in 1866, they invaded 3 different colonies: Ontario, Quebec, and New Brunswick, or tried to invade New Brunswick. And this brought this whole issue of confederation to a head again. It brought it to the forefront in Canadian minds. And this time it pushed Canadians over the top. So Canadians became a nation in 1867 with the Canadian Confederation, where several, not all yet, but several of the Canadian colonies band together and form the Canadian Confederation. So at least we can thank the Fenians for that. So that's the end of today's podcast. Join me again next week. In the meantime, take a look at my website, clandonald.net. Send me an email at clandonald@gmail.com. Like this video, like my Facebook page, send me comments. Because I'd be glad to respond individually to all of them. What else have I got to do other than write my novel? So I'll see you next week. Thank you.